I'm really excited about this first panel to kick us off. This is one that it really brings together the diversity of our partners here it extends really across the United States. And it's really experts from the public and private sector who will explore agricultural water risk and really how the water management aspect on that is so important. Addressing some of the main challenges and opportunities related to changes in agricultural water availability and use. This discussion will include examples from regions where irrigation is expanding, as well as regions where long-term sustainable irrigation faces challenges or is no longer a viable option. Please welcome our session moderator, member of our DWFI's Board of Directors, Felicia Marcus, who many of you may know through her decades of leadership in water policy. She's also been a dedicated friend to the Institute for quite a few years now, Felicia. So, Felicia, please.
Not to confuse you. Good morning, and thank you, Peter, and thank you to the amazing staff of the Institute, and I'm just honored to be a part of its board and to be a part of the greater family looking at the importance of food and water and natural resources, and a particular thanks to Peter, who is a total hero of mine and so many of my friends working in the international as well as the domestic arena. We're all really blessed to have him here. Thank you all for joining what's always an inspiring and educational conference. As Peter said, we're starting off with water risk and how shifting irrigation patterns affect rural economies, not to depress you, because it's always difficult to deal with change and to deal with the challenges of agriculture in general, even in a stable situation, economy, climate, etc. But water risk is a challenge that's shared by all corners of the country and the world, and it's finally actually gaining far more traction at the international and national discourse. For some, it's floods, for others, it's drought and scarcity of all kinds, and for others, sea level rise and the pressure it puts on water quality, whether groundwater or estuarine. In irrigated lands, which are inherently ones with inconsistent or inadequate natural precipitation, water supply or scarcity frequently have a link to quality as well. Water supply hits the headlines far more frequently, but both have impacts on local economies and public health. As we described 2 years ago at this conference, in the Colorado Basin, I'm from the Southwest, we are in a 25-year megadrought, with Lake Mead, the U.S.'s largest reservoir, reaching levels not seen since the lake first filled. We avoided dead pool by several years' worth of interim agreements over the past decade between the 7 states, 2 nations, and 30 tribes that depend on the river for water, and some lovely help from Mother Nature in the last couple of years, although it's short in the Colorado Basin this year compared to California. That system was designed to allow for irrigation of most of the Southwest, with trillions of dollars at risk, not to mention many, many, many communities and their economies. All of the players are scrambling and they are squabbling to come up with new operating rules for the river, replacing operating rules that have accreted on a base that's over 100 years old. So I'm saying that to make you all feel better if that's not where you are. In my own California, water risk is both scarcity and quality, with historic overdraft of an average of 2 million acre-feet per year in the Central Valley. We recently saw the worst 2 droughts in modern history within the same 10-year span, with each having distinctly different twists on what worst means. The 10-year-old, we are almost completely dependent on irrigation as a state. We have the most variable hydrology in the nation by far. It's a characteristic of the Southwest, but much more acute in California, which with irrigation be essential to the economy, food and fiber production engine that makes modern California possible. The 10-year-old state framework under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed after all of the other Western states, but was passed 10 years ago to deal with the challenge of drought, crumbling infrastructure, loss of future storage space, and the need to assure a future for farming and communities in the decades ahead. An estimated 500,000 to 1.5 million acres of farmland will go out of production to right-size our agricultural and our water supply realities. But where that number lands depends upon the actions of numerous communities and individuals who are stepping up in creative and heroic ways to both find fair and agreed upon ways to reduce demand through allocations, fees, trading, more efficient systems, and other measures, and through an enormous push for managed aquifer recharge, including a state-funded land repurposing program that helps transition land to different crops, groundwater recharge basins, nature preserves, solar farms, and whatever a multi-stakeholder local coalition can come up with. There are inspiring examples of environmental and agricultural interests coming together with local water planning and other governance agencies to find win-wins. But enough about California. In every state and every nation, there are unique challenges, competing interests, governance and communications challenges, and the all too frequent lack of resources. Precision water use by all sectors, agricultural, commercial, community, and environmental, are increasingly needed to make the best use of every precious drop for all of the beneficial uses that are dependent upon water. The bottom line is that precipitation patterns are changing. Local economies are at risk, and people are taking actions in many places to react and adapt, particularly with the role of irrigation, either its extension into new spaces or efficiency cropping, activity shifts, collaborative land use efforts, and other creative actions. This morning, we have 4 experts from the academic, farming, corporate, and nonprofit environmental sectors who'll give you a taste in just 12 minutes each of some of the efforts happening on the ground in Mississippi River Valley, High Plains, Oklahoma, Kansas, and other areas in the U.S. in particular to cope with shifting precipitation patterns with a goal of protecting local economies and the environment. We'll then move on to discussion, though I may ask, probably will ask a follow-up question to the panelists as they present as well, and then we'll move to your questions. We're not going to solve everything or wrap it up in a bow, but we hope to let you start off the conference learning about efforts and approaches you may not have heard about to move into the solution space in the dialogue throughout the conference. Our speakers have detailed bios on the webpage, as Francis said, and I encourage you to go there to see the rich experience they bring to this discussion. And for now, I'll just give you 1 or 2 lines so we can move right to the discussion. Dr. Nico Quintana is the water economist for the National Center for Alluvial Aquifer Research and an assistant research professor at Mississippi State University, where he studies the paradoxical decline of an aquifer in an area with abundant precipitation and surface water sources. Ed Prosser is the Senior VP for Special Projects at Scholar, and he joined Scholar after 24 years in a variety of impressive roles at Conagra Brands. Clay Pope is a farmer rancher from Loyal, Oklahoma, who is also the Partnership and External Affairs Manager of the Nature Conservancy of Oklahoma, and he has had a long and varied career in more roles than anyone but me, I think, that I can think of. Lindsay Dowell is the Spatial Data Science Lead for the Corporate Engagement Team at the Nature Conservancy and focuses on food and water. I'm going to turn to Nico now to come on up and give his presentation. There's a thing there telling you the time, and then I will have a soft chime that'll also go off at the end. Take it away.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I think you said it all, so we can save the 12 minutes maybe.
Yeah, sorry.
But there's a great emphasis on keeping up with time and everything, and it's very anxiety-inducing. So I'll start my presentation with a conclusion maybe. My argument today will be that the shifting patterns in irrigation is threatening generational farming, at least in the area where I operate, which is the Mississippi Delta. And my argument is that generational farming is a key component of water conservation. Let me start with this map of the U.S. It shows the brown dots there shows you counties that have decreased irrigated acreage over time, and the blue dots show counties where irrigation has expanded over time. And my idea today is to talk to you about the Mississippi Delta with the hope that it will resonate in other places across the world. And one of the things that you can see in this pattern is that decrease in acreage, irrigated acreage, generally follows depletion of aquifers. It's not the full story, but that's part of it. And anytime you have a decrease in irrigated acreage, that's a loss in productivity. So the big challenge in agricultural water with decreasing acreage is that we need to remain on that increasing productivity curve that would allow us to feed and clothe the world. So that productivity loss has to be made elsewhere. And presumably, productivity loss to lack of water or irrigation is going to have to be made up in places where there is water. And so this map shows how aquifers have changed over time, and it kind of tracks the depletion. Oh, I'm clicking the wrong. And as I say, it's not the complete picture, but when you combine that with a precipitation, map of precipitation, which is a proxy for water availability, in essence, it tells a big part of the history of what's going on with the irrigated acreage. My home aquifer is the Mississippi River Valley alluvial aquifer. And the Mississippi Delta is encircled in red over there in the acreage map. And the Mississippi River Valley alluvial aquifer is characterized by fast recharge and a lot of runoff. When you compare it to the other main aquifers, you see that we do have the ability to exploit that aquifer better because we have higher recharge, but we have a whole lot of runoff. And there's where the opportunity lies. As a reference, it has already surpassed the High Plains aquifer in terms of total withdrawals for irrigation. In the High Plains, generally, irrigated acreage is decreasing due to depleting aquifers and deeper wells, and in our case, it's expanding, except Nebraska, of course, which we just heard how blessed they are in terms of water, at least. And so, for us, at least, the solution is not efficiency. It doesn't hurt, it helps a lot. If nothing else, it helps you buy time, and it's closely related to productivity, so higher efficiency may mean higher returns for the farmers, which would allow them to invest in better conservation practices. But our situation in the Mississippi Delta is very different from what you would imagine, certainly from western Kansas or Oklahoma, I presume. That little plant there, it's corn that we planted on February 28th, and I doubt many in the room would have planted corn in February. And so we have a long season, it's warm, we have high evapotranspirative demand, we have a flat topography, and so we have, as much as we have concerns about delivering water to crops, we do have drainage concerns, and in many cases, the typical solution of pressurized systems just for water conservation doesn't quite cut it in that region. Where this system have a chance of being successful in that region is productivity, as particularly profitability. So if you convert, if you sell that system with fertigation and the ability to produce more than one crop per year, etc., then that's where the chance for these type of systems to work. Like we irrigate our irrigation wells, you have a farmer starting to come down to 1,200 gallons per minute, he start to be concerned. His solution is to put another well. And so they need to deliver that water fast, and we do it through furrow irrigation. You can see in the other picture that we have both the furrow and the pressurized system in there. With all that, even it's flooded essentially for irrigation. The water use, the irrigation depth is not that high. For instance, our average for soybean is about 9 inches irrigation depth per year. If you look at western Kansas, some counties I have data for with center pivot, they're about 14 inches. So the potential to save from 9 inches to less than that with a pressurized system, the payoff for such system is not in the water conservation or reduced water costs, because you are pumping from shallow aquifers and you need to deliver water quickly. So the bottom line is, what do? We expect a future where we'll have increased water use, yet we need to save groundwater because the aquifer is depleting. And so I'm not a genius, that's why I'm an economist. So the only solution is you gotta take advantage of that runoff, capture it, store it, reuse it, and tap into your surface water sources. Now, to talk about the impact on communities, getting closer to the generational farming conclusion, this map shows the percentage of state gross product that is derived from agricultural production. And you can see that map basically tracks your irrigation map as well. So the impact of irrigation on the state economies is clear, and I don't think I need to argue too much to convince you that state economies do have an impact on rural communities. So in terms of the Mississippi Delta, the big challenge is against generational farming. The problem in the Delta is with these row crops right now, the system is one main cash crop, which is in 70% of the acres, soybean. And most of you would know where the soybean markets are this year at. And so these guys are barely scraping by. And this reminds me of an old joke from my MBA, where they talk about the GM managers. They lose money on each car and they try to make it up in volume. And so we may be putting these family farms in a similar spot, in which they are trying to make up for small margins by increasing acreages. But in a bad market year, they're really making up their per acre losses with more acres. And so that's the big threat. So we think at the National Center for Alluvial Aquifer Research, we're working on different systems around doing multiple crops per year, incorporating solutions to increase productivity within the existing irrigation system, so they can have the financial resources to think about conservation, because conservation is expensive. So what you need to sell them is a more profitable production system that has the water conservation built in it. Generational farming is important for conservation because all this water recovery infrastructure, capturing pluvial and irrigation runoff and reusing it, is expensive. So for 160 acres, that's about $150,000 investment. How much is another well when he starts getting to 1,200 gallons per minute? That's $15,000, so it's 10 times more expensive. Generational farming allows that system to be recovering that investment over a longer period. But there is a dynamic gap that could be that needs to be filled by policy. Farmers are concerned about how to pay their loans this year, so they do have that long-term concern. They don't want to lose the family farm, but they need to pay the bank at the end of the year. So there is a policy gap that can be bridged with policy. And that's all I got with a minute to spare. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask you, don't leave yet. No, that was excellent. I actually loved the variety of data that you showed and also the insight into all of it. In the work you're doing, and you touched on this in your conversation, what's been the hardest thing to convey to farmers about the need to think generationally or to explain the limitations on just continuing to drill more wells? So this is more of that, and with a comma, and then you said there's a policy gap that can fill it. If you can talk a little about the kind of policies you have in mind.
Yes. So in my view, and Drew Golson is our irrigation specialist, he may want to add on this, but from what I can see, the biggest challenge is that they're really going for that acreage, and they're going after yields. And so when they come, so your irrigation is in economics we call it the weekly essential input, meaning you have already did everything you've done in the season, and that last irrigation event, you already paid for all your fertilizer, and what the farmer is trying to do is to maximize that paycheck from the elevator or whatever their broker or whatever they sell so the cost of pumping that last irrigation event, which is 3 inches at a time, is very little. In his mind, the diesel he already paid for, the labor he's got payroll anyway, and so it's very hard to make him see that marginal decision at the end, and that I could save him that last 3 inches. He might already be at the top of where he needs to be. And so one of the things we say at Anchor, we tell them is, listen, if you're protecting yield, if you're not irrigating to gain yield, if you're protecting yield, you probably are already overwatering. And then the other thing is the acreage. When you need to make a pond and tailwater recovery, that's land that you have to put aside. And these guys are trying to make it up in volume, increase their acreage because they make so little per acre, so they are not ready to give up any acreage in their farm. So I would say from the perspective that I'm presenting, those two are the main challenges. You think that about covers? Yeah.
And how can policy help fill the?
So the policy is because it's dynamic, right? So the farm has to pay the bank at the end of the year, and in this year, for sure, many soybean farmers are going to be selling parts of land to keep the rest alive, and that's painful for them. And so having them to think, listen, you got to invest this, and I promise you, 60 years from now, it paid off. He's not thinking that far. They're trying not to get to lose their farm for the generation. So that's what I call the dynamic gap that the policy can bridge. So it's either the financing, it's either the cost sharing. Equip in Mississippi at least have had the funds to help them build those infrastructures, and so on and so forth. So that's where I think I don't think there's any room. I don't see any way that a regulator can come and tell a farmer what to do in a productive manner. I mean, it may conserve water, but I'm not sure they have enough information or enough elements of the gamble to see this is the level. It's got to be farmer either buy-in, or it has to be a farming initiative, or a very high participation of farmers in the design of the policy.
Great, thank you. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Ed, you're up.
Well, 1,800 gallon a minute wells. I'm moving to Mississippi.
Yeah.
Again?
Yeah, that's amazing. My name's Ed Prosser. I'm the SVP of Special Projects at Schooler. I am a grain trader and a farmer. I knew this room was going to be intimidating with all the academics, and this incline doesn't help. It feels like everyone's coming after us. So I'm not an expert on anything. I am going to talk a little bit about what we're doing as a commercial ag company to try to facilitate economic activity, both in the community, for the farmers that we serve and the communities that they live in. How are we moving?
Yeah, hit that, no, that one.
This one?
Try the green one.
Bingo. A little bit about what Schooler is. We're headquartered in Omaha. We're a traditional ag company. We traded over 1 billion bushels of corn last year. We serve 17,000 farmer customers. Mostly, we provide a market for their grain. We do ingredients. We also handle livestock. But what we're here to talk about today is our footprint in this part of the world, quite frankly. When you ask me as a farmer what the definition of sustainability is, it's I make enough money this year so I get a farm next year. And really, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be commercial in size in an area that has benefited from a lot of economic activity around irrigation, but is changing very quickly. This happens to be the part of the world that I grew up in, and those 800-gallon wells when I was in high school are now 400-gallon wells. We're trying to do things like a half a circle of milo and a half a circle of corn, cover crops. We keep going down the line to try to figure out new solutions to make less water more productive. And quite frankly, I will tell you, the American farmer is doing just that. We're making more corn, more beans, more wheat, and more sorghum with less inputs every year. But it continues to be, particularly in this geography, as water resources continue to dwindle, we felt like there needed to be another opportunity. While renewables aren't food, they are bids for our output, which create the sustainability for our communities. Renewable fuels right now, and certainly we can change this over time, but today, North America makes more calories than we can eat or export. Certainly in today's environment, with our export markets somewhat in limbo, renewable fuels continue to be a bigger part of the bids for our commodities. We do think that there's an opportunity for the Great Plains to participate in that. Winter canola is a crop that has a long history. It has been a specialty niche crop, I think, mostly centered around Oklahoma with wheat on wheat on wheat continuous rotation. It happens to create twice as much oil per bushel as soybeans. If oil is going to be our goal around lipid production that creates renewable fuels, we think it is an interesting opportunity. We have better yield potential. We create more forage, and it grows where we have water problems. This map shows a little bit of the concentration. The black oval is the center around our new facility in Goodland, Kansas that we just commissioned to crush oilseeds for both food use and renewables, but certainly a focus on renewables. And it's focused on a new crop for the Great Plains. One I want to talk about a little bit is the blue circle. And the reason is that is a particular interest for us on limited irrigation and what we can do with canola. The neat thing about winter canola, first of all, it overwinters, which creates opportunities for keeping the ground covered and some carbon sequestration, which is another story we can talk about. But that's also the part of the world where we continue to have trouble with declining water. So we have, over the course of the last 2 years in Gray County, Kansas, converted limited irrigation circles from milo and corn to canola to create canola that we went back to Goodland with renewable diesel. The byproduct of that process is also canola meal, which happens to be a great feedstock for a growing dairy cow herd. Canola water use is neat for 2 reasons. First of all, it doesn't take as much as corn. But maybe more importantly, for those of you that are close to this part of the world, instead of putting water on in July and August when everybody wants to pump on corn, we're pumping water in March and April, where the water tables are higher, transevaporation's lower. We continue to think of different ways of diversifying our water use, and hopefully Schooler's providing that as an opportunity. This gives you an idea of the water use our winter canola is versus corn, sunflowers. It's actually like a lot like sunflowers. Sunflowers is an interesting case study for food and water use on the Great Plains. We certainly can grow it. The problem is nobody wanted to buy it. That's the idea, is that it can't be just something that works for the production cycle. We got to have something to work on the marketing cycle. And from the perspective of what Schooler tries to do for our 17,000 growers is connect that where we're growing something that we can make a market on. Again, gets into the dormant season. This is a lot of scientific stuff that, quite frankly, I don't understand that well. But it goes towards this idea that we continue to create more forage. It works on a rotation where adding canola in a winter wheat rotation creates soil health and has follow-on yield opportunities with the wheat following canola, which this chart shows. So we had Schooler bought a facility in Goodland, Kansas, which is in extreme northwest Kansas, in 2020, and it happened to have an old sun crush plant on it. We retrofitted that. It started here in January as a dual crush facility. It crushes small soft seeds, which is canola, camelina, carinata, whatever happens to figure out the best marketing path. It also crushes soybeans because we need to make sure that it runs 12 months out of the year, and for right now, the plant would need about 500,000 acres of canola to run 12 months out of the year. The January crop report says that Oklahoma and Kansas has 42,000 acres this year. That was 5,000 2 years ago, so we're on the right path. I do think there continues to be opportunity in the space. This idea of pushing a new crop is a huge step. The infrastructure that we take for granted in so many things, like what's the price of canola today? Well, the price of corn, you listen to the radio and the guy tells you 4 times a day what the price of corn's worth, and they don't tell you what price canola's worth. The price discovery mechanism is difficult. The huge lift around crop insurance, and anybody that farms from here west understands that crop insurance, that's one of the first 2 or 3 questions I get from farmers about how do I work into a risk management. Kansas has 105 counties. I have 5 of them today that have APHs that we can use on crop insurance for canola. So it is this body of work that needs to get done to create what we take for granted with our 4 major crops. I think is work that is well placed, but it's going to continue to take a lot of time and effort. The one thing that I will tell you, and I spent a lot of time in front of farmers, they're ready. They want to work. They want opportunities. And as much as people in the city especially talk about how they don't like technology or they're slow to change, that's not the case at all. If we give them a market that provides return that is sustainable, they'll stand in line. And hopefully Schooler is going to be in that mix somewhere. We're going to have, I'm sure, a lot of different solutions. Hopefully this is a small one.
That was great. Thank you so much. Now, Ed, you've worked in the High Plains and beyond. And this is really interesting because you focused on crop shifting, especially the value of winter canola. Two questions. One is, what other things have you seen growers do other than crop shifting that's helpful? And then maybe I'll make this answer both or pick one. Because the second one, again, talks about policy, which is there's a lot of work to do. How can local governments or other governments help shape policy to help this transition be easier for folks?
Well, I will say the state of Kansas and the community in Goodland were instrumental in helping us bring manufacturing back to the Midwest. So that is a partnership that has to happen. And also that brings that community. For those of you that grew up west of here in the town of 4,000, that's now 2,000, in a graduating class of 100, that's now 50. That's me. And trying to figure out how water works with those economies and those rural communities to keep things stable is a real piece of what we want to do, because not only do we do business in these communities, our employees live there, and somebody said something about generational. I mean, we want to be here not just for the next 5 years, but for the next 50 and beyond.
No, that's great, and thank you for that point. It's interesting. I do a lot of work in the urban arena, and one of the things some people struggle with is getting people to invest for future generations. A much more short-term thinking that you see in agricultural communities where people announce which generation farmer they are, and every issue is not losing something that you've been bequeathed and leaving something for your kids and your kids' kids, which is one of the beauties of working in agricultural communities.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That was great. Take it away, Clay. Yep.
Well, first of all, can you hear me? Can y'all hear me okay? I kind of feel like I ought to be asking you about your car insurance with this thing right here on my head. And I am more than 100 miles from home, so I guess I am an expert too. But I always kind of feel funny when I'm in these panels and it's like professor or corporate, and it's, hey, I'm Clay Pope, farmer and rancher from Lowell, Oklahoma. How y'all doing? So I'm going to talk a little bit more from a perspective, though. We're here to talk. I know a lot of the focus is on irrigation. I'm actually from a part of Oklahoma where we're primarily dry land agriculture, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about what we're seeing as far as weather patterns in the state and how that all builds up to water challenges in the state of Oklahoma. And I think, is the green button the one I'm supposed to? Yeah. This one, the big one? Okay. I wanted to put this picture up here because we're wanting to talk about water, and this is one of the things that, when you think about water in the state of Oklahoma, a little bit about the history of Oklahoma, and everybody knows the Dust Bowl, and Oklahoma, our even state song even talks about how the wind comes sweeping down the plains. Extreme weather is something that we've always lived with in the southern plains. Well, all of us in the Great Plains understand that. But I wanted to put up here because you can kind of see some of the trends that we've seen over the history of Oklahoma since settlement as far as droughts and heavy rain events. Now, there is something a little unusual there, that if you get down toward the end, the 20-year wet signal, you start to see that some of the policy decisions that we've made in the state of Oklahoma have been based really on an anomaly, a time when we did have rain levels that were a little bit heavier than we've seen in the past. But what I really wanted to show are those dips and peaks as far as precipitation in the state, and then move on, if I can get the button to work. to the next picture, which actually gives a little bit better picture from what we're seeing right now. You know, we think about those drought periods followed by heavy rain periods, but actually what we're seeing more in the state of Oklahoma are flash droughts. Now, I'm 55 years old. I've grown up in Oklahoma. All of us in this part of the world, especially in Oklahoma, we like to joke about how every spring we have what we call weather porn. All the local television stations with, of course, thunderstorm warnings, tornado warnings, they all try to outdo each other. But one thing growing up in Oklahoma you never hear much of is flash drought. But that's become a term of art that you're hearing more and more as we move forward in the future because we are seeing changes in our precipitation patterns. We're seeing that those times of heavy rain, we're actually getting about the same rain that we've always had, but it's coming in chunks. And you have those times when you have a heavy rain event followed by that more dry period. In fact, this right here shows the period from 21 to 24 when you actually were seeing a time frame when we were having a drought that everybody was comparing to droughts that we've seen in the past, like 11 to 14, the 1950s, the 1930s. But at the end of the day, it really wasn't one pure dry period. It was actually those dips followed by those peaks. And that's something that's a real concern because how do you hold on to that moisture when you get it? How do you prepare producers to deal with those extreme periods of dry that follow those periods of wet? Because we're seeing some overall changes in climate trends, and it's not just in precipitation. We're also seeing an increase in our average temperature. If you look at the state of Oklahoma, our temperature has increased 1.2, between 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the early 20th century. And a lot of folks don't think that's that big of a deal. But just a small change in those temperature patterns can have a huge effect. We're actually seeing changes in our rainfall patterns. I talked about how it was coming in chunks. We're also seeing it change in the time of the year. One of the phenomenons that we've seen with climate change in Oklahoma is that we are, again, seeing about the same amount of rain that we've always seen. But the rains that we've always counted on, I talk about growing up in Oklahoma, we always said it was going to rain during the state fair in the fall. You could always count on rain during the state fair in the fall. And you could always count on whether the rains to come this part of the time of the year in the spring. It's not that way anymore. We're actually seeing those rains come later in the spring and earlier in the fall. In fact, some people feel like I live west of I-35. I live about 45 miles, if you know anything about Oklahoma. Well, it's Oklahoma City. I live about 70 miles west-northwest of Oklahoma City. And we're actually seeing a phenomenon where our rain patterns are actually starting to mimic a little bit more the monsoons that you see further to the west of us. And that's a real challenge because that does impact production agriculture. It was mentioned earlier about canola and the wheat on wheat in my part of the world, continuous crop, dual purpose wheat. Well, that's based on that idea that you're going to have those timely rains that help make sure that you have the good crop production for that winter wheat. That's changing. And that is a challenge that we need to consider. Another thing, too, that I think is kind of fun, if you look on down to the slide, down there, the 100th meridian semi-arid climate has shifted east in the state of Oklahoma. I talk about how we're starting to mimic a little bit more of the rainfall patterns further west of us. I actually have a friend that lives in the Oklahoma Panhandle. If you know anything about Oklahoma geography, the Panhandle is actually as long as the rest of the state of Oklahoma is. And Woodward, Oklahoma, which is kind of up in that corner where the main body of the state reaches the Panhandle, my friend who lives up at Slapout said anything east of Woodward is eastern Oklahoma. Well, I got to tell him when they moved the line to 81 Highway, which is about 30 miles west where I live, that I now live in western Oklahoma too. We're seeing those subtle changes and it's having a huge impact. Again, those small changes in annual rainfall, but we are seeing some changes. Like I said, drier summers, wetter winters, intense precipitation frequently continued. It continues to increase, but is followed by those dry periods. We have those high soaking rains, and I think from a producer perspective, especially for a dryland producer like me, that goes back to that challenge. When we do get that rain, how do we hang on to it? Because if we are seeing those periods of flash droughts in between those precipitation times, how do we make sure that we've got that moisture so that we're not losing it, that we are holding it on for the soil? But when you do have those heavy rain events, challenges that we see come along with that is more runoff and flooding. That has impacts on crop production. It also means more challenges for non-point source pollution, making sure that we're addressing some of the runoff coming off, and obviously increased erosion. Those are some challenges that definitely we're seeing with these changes in precipitation patterns. If I can get my thing to move. I promise there's another slide. There it is. And that's what, again, when you talk about temperature as well, one of the things with that small increase in temperature that we're seeing is that when it does turn off dry, those droughts feed on themselves. You know, the story about what we are seeing with climate change, as I mentioned in my part of the world, we like to talk about the crazy weather. Crazy weather we've always seen is just getting shot on steroids. And that increase in temperature is actually creating a situation where those droughts are more commonly feeding on themselves. And it needs more energy to try to break those drought cycles. And that's a challenge definitely that we're seeing in my part of the world as well. And there we go. Well, that's okay. I'll jump into what we do. Because at the end of the day, I had another slide that was talking a little bit about some of these other changes. But really what it gets right down to it, we can talk about the problems all day long, but what do we do about it? You know, what are we going to do to better prepare producers for this new future that we're dealing with? You know, at the end of the day, at least in my part of the world, the big thing that I think we really need to be focusing on is greater adoption of those land treatment practices that help us deal with those changes in extreme weather events. Whether you want to call it soil health, good conservation, climate smart agriculture, regenerative agriculture, whatever it comes down to. Trying to do those things to minimize that moisture loss and to help us control erosion when we have those heavy rain events. You know, I as an agriculture producer, I spend a lot of time disking ground in those wheat fields out in western Oklahoma. And Dad always said, you want to open up that ground to take in rain and bring that moisture up to meet the rain when it's going to come. Yeah, we're bringing moisture up, it's going away to evaporation. How can we make sure that we hang on to that moisture? And it's by those land treatment practices. That's the changes that we need to do. We need greater adoption of improved irrigation practices. Now, I'm not an irrigator. You guys know a lot better than I do about what can and can't be done on irrigation. But at the end of the day, we can do things, whether it's drag and drip, whether it's doing things as far as changing our systems. These are things that we need to do. And with that comes a need for more technical and financial assistance and research. All of this is going back to the policy area. As mentioned, I farm and ranch, but I also work for the Nature Conservancy. I do government relations for TNC in Oklahoma. I picked a heck of a time to go back into lobbying, quite frankly, but that's another story. But the bottom line is that at the very time that we need to have more resources to help agriculture producers make these changes, to adopt these practices, is the time that we're starting to see pressure on the other side to take those resources away. As was mentioned earlier, farmers and ranchers have to make a living. Talk about sustainability is making sure that you got enough money to keep the operation going on for the next year. Farming and ranching isn't a charity operation. You've got to be able to make a living. And in my part of the world, when you start getting down into winter wheat country, the value per acre of those crops is a whole heck of a lot less than you get in corn and bean country. We've got to have the ability to help those agriculture producers to adjust, to make those changes, to make those investments, and to have the technical assistance to help them to understand what it is that they need to do or what they can do. You've got to have those resources out there, both as far as financial assistance to help to adopt those practices, and the human capital out there, the experts that can go out on the land and tell people, give them suggestions as to what they can do in their operation to better prepare for these challenging times. And, you know, when you talk about challenges to adoption of these barriers, you know, I put this on the bottom there. I work for TNC now. The last 10 years, I've also been, before I worked with TNC, I was doing outreach for the Southern Plains Climate Hub. And one of the things that when I talk to a group of producers, you can, you know, as everybody in this room knows, you say the word climate change in some crowds, you can have an interesting conversation based off of just those two words. But at the end of the day, there may be folks out there that don't believe in climate change, but I have yet to run into a person that doesn't believe in droughts and floods. But we've got to understand that we've got to address this challenge in a way that does speak the language to the producers, meet them where they're at, understand their concerns and their realities. Now, one of the things with that too, I think, going back to what I said about at the very time that we need more resources to help agriculture producers make these changes, those resources are going away. It also means that we need to have some serious conversations with our opinion shapers and our policymakers to help them understand this is something they need to do, because there's plenty of folks out there that are willing to tell people that there's not any problem. You know, everybody likes to have their opinions reinforced. And when you're sitting there, you're struggling trying to do stuff, and you really, you know, you hear this stuff about all these changes coming at you. You've got all these challenges that you've got to meet. Having somebody come in and pat you on the back and say, well, there's not really any problems there. This is all overblown. Just don't worry about it at all, and basically give you a story that doesn't help you at all. That's a real challenge in a political sense, guys. It really is. I mean, that's one of the things that you know you run into so much of the time, is that people who should be helping individuals or coming up with policy options to put producers and our rural communities in better positions to deal with these natural resource challenges, unfortunately have not done a really good job about thinking about it. And when they do think about it, they seem to come from another direction to try to whip up to, well, I don't want to get into that because I get in a lot of political problems if I say that. But the bottom line is we need to have leadership, we need to have resources, and we need to have a focus to make sure that our agricultural producers and our communities are better prepared for the future, because we are seeing some serious challenges when it comes to water, and it's not going to change any better any time in the near future. So with that, I'm down to 26 seconds on the shot clock, and I'm not a very good ball handler, so I'm going to end it there.
You are an excellent ball handler. Thank you. Now, Clay, it's interesting because you've played a variety of roles, a lot of them being working with legislatures and translating, communicating between people in a really effective way, made more effective in this sphere by the fact that you also farm and ranch at the same time. So you know what you're talking about. You're not just speaking theoretically. You could work anywhere, been RCDs, all kinds of things. Why the Nature Conservancy? Why do you view that as a good platform for this mix of work?
Well, that's what you, why did I, well, one thing, they offered me the job. That was one thing. The other thing is, though, is that the position that I hold with TNC is Partnership and External Affairs Manager, and having the ability, it's just that I tell everybody that's a fancy way to say I'm a glorified field man and lobbyist. But having the chance to go out and visit with agriculture producers, to talk with organizations, go to those Farm Bureau, Farmers Union meetings, Cattlemen's Association, talk to them about some of these challenges from a policy perspective, and to be involved in policy. Mm-hmm. Because I do think we are at a stage as a country that we need to seriously consider what's going on with our natural resource bases. I mentioned a little bit about soil erosion, and Oklahoma talking about natural resource concerns. You can't get out of the room without talking about the Dust Bowl. But one of the things I always like, I can't hold down a job. Hell, I was a state rep. I worked for the Conservation District. I worked for USDA, and now I'm working for TNC. So I've jumped around a whole lot of different places. But the only reason I say that is when I worked for the Conservation District from the drought to 11 to 14, I always like to tell people is that, everybody talks about Dust Bowl in Oklahoma. And the 1930s is what everybody always thinks about. Well, the drought of the 50s was worse than the drought of the 30s. And for a lot of Oklahoma, the drought from 2011 to 2014 was worse than the drought of the 1950s. Now, I wasn't the best student in school, but I think I would have picked up pretty quick if they were talking about the Great Dust Bowl of the 1950s. Now, there was some dirt moving, but it was nothing like we saw in the 1930s. 2011 to 14, there was some dirt moving then too, but it was not near as bad as it was in the 50s and the 30s because of the fact that the government stepped up and provided those resources to those agriculture producers to help them deal with that natural resource challenge, which is soil erosion. And they came in not with the iron fist of regulation, with the open hand of friendship, with that technical assistance and financial assistance I was talking about. But at the end of the day, even with the fact that we've done such a good job that we hit a record drought and we don't see the massive dusters that hold together all the way from Oklahoma go out and cover ships in the Atlantic Ocean with dirt that started in the southern plains, even though that's not happening, you can run the numbers yourself. For every pound of wheat we grow in the state of Oklahoma today, we lose 3 pounds of soil. That's not, you talk about sustainability, that ain't sustainable. And let's take all the touchy-feely stuff out of it. As a farmer and rancher, what's the basis of all your wealth? It's the soil. And if you're not doing things to protect that resource base, don't farm. Do yourself a favor. Don't waste time. Go down, get your money out of the bank, go down the creek, start throwing in dollar bills, because that's basically what you're doing. If you're not doing things to protect that resource base, you're burning up that capital and it's going to be gone. And now, as a nation, now you get into touchy-feely stuff, we got to feed and clothe 10 billion people. Hey, at the end of the day, we've got to protect that resource. And it's already a declining resource base because our best farm ground's already under concrete in our cities. We've got to do what we can to protect that moving forward. And that's why, going back to Nature Conservancy, having the chance to be involved in those policy discussions, because we have to have that discussion. We have to come up with ideas to better prepare for this extreme future, because we were facing challenges before. But what we're seeing as far as changing weather trends, it's not going to get any easier. And we've got to give those tools out there to make sure that we protect that resource base, that we take care of it for the future, and that we can feed and clothe a growing population on a shrinking land base. So with that would be my answer.
Thank you. And you answered my second question too with it. Lindsay, you get to bring us home.
Great. I think as being introduced as a spatial scientist, I think my presentation is the only one without maps, which is pretty remarkable.
That's funny.
Lovely to be here. I'm hoping to complement what we've heard so far with more around the conversation that's happening at the global scale, specifically with global food and beverage companies and how they connect to some of the challenges we're talking through. So I think it helps to provide a little bit of context as to how we got here, what the water stewardship journey and evolution of that has looked like for companies. So water risk and addressing water risk for large companies originally started with sort of this ad hoc approach to looking at their direct operations. These are facilities that they own. The financial narrative and connection is really clear. They know exactly where they sit in a basin. They have more control over how they're managed. And ultimately, the culpability is clear. There's no real skirting responsibility around these facilities. So they needed to do something to react to emerging risks as they came up. In the last decade, though, we've seen the emergence of global water risk assessment tools like Aqueduct and WWF Water Risk Filter, which provide a standardized methodology to look at a myriad of water risks, including physical, among others. And companies have been able to apply that standardized methodology to all of their facilities. And this enables them to kind of subset facilities that fall in that high-risk bucket. So rather than being reactive and ad hoc, they can sort of strategize and develop a strategy around this subset of what's considered high risk. And this is a lot of what has supported the goal language that we see now. So companies subsetting a set of facilities or identifying priority basins where they will engage in watershed health activities or replenishment activities or whatever it is. Now, we have not seen this approach or this language, this external goal communication emerge in identifying priority basins on the upstream side, the geographies that companies are connected to in sourcing their ingredients. However, there's growing awareness of the sheer outsized dependency and impact that exists in this area of their value chain. For most commodities, we're talking about around 90% of the total water footprint that exists in that agricultural production stage, which totally eclipses all of the water that's used in the subsequent stages. This awareness, this growing awareness, is likely due to the sheer number of sourcing disruptions that we're seeing in the news across the world, whether it be shipping delays or crop failures or some other source of disruption. No supply chain or community is really protected from this growing risk. Now, in terms of the responses and strategies to supply chain disruptions or sourcing disruptions, we've seen a few. On the most reactive end, it's companies just sort of responding in the moment. Oh, there's been a drought in Brazil and we can't source the volume of soy that we expected, we'll buy it from Argentina instead. This is, for globally distributed crops, a pretty effective strategy, and it only requires companies to invest what they need. They only have to pay when there is a sourcing disruption rather than investing proactively in sort of that long-term vision. That's really hard to kind of build support around, especially for a sustainability budget. Another option in cases where we have growing unmitigatable legal risks, companies might decide to sort of surgically extract themselves and halt any activities in a particular geography. Now, this comes after much deliberation as an absolute last resort, but in some cases is necessary if it just doesn't make sense to be operating in a specific place, growing things in a specific place, et cetera. Now, the last two options are much more exciting. It's where the innovation lies. It's where there's so much more opportunity to grow and build for kind of a better future. Think about things in a new way, rather than sort of living in this scarcity mindset of things are only going to get worse from here. One is in sort of the R&D space. Companies thinking about how can we reduce our dependency on this finite resource and build more flexibility and resilience in our supply chain. Maybe it's through thinking through ingredients. Can we reformulate some of our products? Can we build new product lines that use more sorghum rather than wheat? Or in some of the cases that we heard Bob talking about in different supply chains. Can we think about waste? Can we reduce waste at some point in the supply chain so that we're not needing as much volumes up front? Or can we use byproducts at some point, et cetera, et cetera? So much room to innovate and and explore. Now, the last one, as we see the number of sourcing disruptions increase and the reach of them increase, we're going to lose the give in these globally distributed commodity markets to the point where it's going to be a financial imperative to invest in specific landscapes and rebuild that resilience to protect businesses and their profits long term, in addition to these local communities. This is not only important from a financial perspective, a long-term financial perspective, it's also completely in line with all the guidance we hear around climate and net zero targets, biodiversity risk approaches, regenerative agriculture programs, all of which are nudging companies to get to know their supply chain, to build relationships with suppliers, to seek visibility to producer level where strategic and possible, to build multi-year programs, to provide innovative financing to communities, to collect data over time and track impact, to basically sort of cement presence in a specific place and really invest. And so why would we have a siloed approach to water? It makes so much more sense to kind of think about all of those things in that strategy as cohesive. Now, if the end goal is getting to these geographies where we want to invest, where it is strategic to invest, let's go back to sort of the starting point of companies. So we're seeing these global maps. It's a series of colors and numbers and categories. But when we're talking about a massive company, in the upstream, all of the ingredients that they source, this could very well be 1,000 basins, and many of them falling in that high-risk bucket. So far too many to prioritize effectively, to all throw into that, we'll do something here. We just end up diluting resources, not really moving the needle in any one place. So we need additional criteria to refine that list further. So on the company side, we could think about where has sourcing been stable the last few years? Where might we have supplier relationships that are really important to maintain? Where do we see regulatory requirements on the horizon that we want to get ahead of? Where are we sourcing commodities for which we buy a large portion of the total market? And it's important for us to kind of preserve those geographies, et cetera, et cetera. And then we can look on the landscape side. Where do we have existing implementation partners that are really well networked? Where do we have community champions? Where is governance working with us rather than against us? Where do we have strong public funding opportunities? Where do we have examples of what this could look like, examples of solutions, examples of technology and distributors, et cetera, et cetera? So in applying those two lenses, we can arrive at a subset of places where we have high business importance and strong enabling conditions. And this gives us a set of priority locations where we're likely to get that internal support from companies to invest because it makes sense for their sort of long-term business resilience and continue investing, and a community that is ready to receive those resources and put them to work. Now, in terms of what this looks like in practice, the execution of these programs, it can look very different depending on the complexity and the context of the landscape. So if we, on the one hand, think about a company sourcing dairy, for example, and they identify some strong water quality risks linked to their supply chain, they might design a program where they're buying anaerobic digesters, distributing them, and this, in addition to delivering on some of their climate goals, is reducing the amount of manure runoff and nutrient pollution in freshwater systems. Now, it's highly possible that this is a contained solution within one supply chain that sufficiently addresses a freshwater challenge. However, when we're talking about a resilience goal, something like drought resilience, achieving drought resilience, it's highly unlikely that a single company operating independently can adequately get there. And that's because building resilience requires innovative solutions at multiple scales that are contributing to flexibility and redundancy, and that's all outside of the purview of one company, outside of their scope of influence. So it requires a collective action approach, wherein multiple stakeholders are coming together, they're agreeing on sort of a vision, a movement forward, a pathway forward, and that group of stakeholders can be companies that share this sourcing landscape. They share risk in a specific foodscape. And the other stakeholders on the ground who have stake in sort of the long-term resilience of this landscape and its ability to continue growing food or other commodities. Now, in addition to sort of all of these interventions at different scales and opportunities. We've heard a lot about the market piece and that being important. If we're going to explore a crop switching scenario, we need to make sure that we have a strong market opportunity available waiting for farmers in that scenario. And so companies can sort of bring that through this collective action initiative, can bring some of those market solutions to the table. But we also need reinforcement from regulation and from policy. It would be such a shame to have design this collective action initiative, have all of these solutions sort of working together just to make room for another industry to come in or for a growing city population. And so we really need that reinforcement from local governance to make sure that the resilience contributions are preserved for their intended purpose. Now, we have very few examples of collective action in agricultural landscapes, specifically where we see complex rotations with these components and this design. But it's a really compelling opportunity and something that many organizations, including TNC, are actively trying to explore and think about to sort of design what could this look like? What do we need to sort of get there? What are the major barriers that we need to address? And I think the really exciting, the thing that's driving us forward, the exciting piece, and what we've heard in all of the previous talks, is that this is really sort of a backstop of bringing more innovative financing, more market opportunities to the table to support those rural communities that are actively sort of ready for that transition. They just sort of need some support in reducing that short-term risk. And so I think it's a useful place to start, and sort of if we can crack that puzzle, if we can bring these resources to the table, we can start to accelerate and respond to some of the excitement that we're hearing from these agricultural communities. Thanks.
Thank you. That was great. Now, that was very cool. You know, you've had a varied range of experience in this corporate and agricultural stewardship arena. What's the most interesting thing you've seen?
Gosh, I've seen so many interesting things. I think that's what makes this job so lovely. I was on a trip to South Africa recently where obviously that there's a community that has experienced really real responses to drought. Day zero was everybody was watching around the world. And in response, I think, to that, we've seen the agricultural systems really adapt. And so we've seen the emergence of new seeders that can compete with these extremely rocky soils. I've never seen rocky soils this rocky in a no-till system. But they have these incredible seeders that are able to seed in these soils without tilling so that they can preserve as much soil moisture as they can. We also think they're exploring invasive species removal projects, even though that's really expensive and you have teams on your farm and there's a privacy element that maybe is less appealing. But the invasive species are incredibly thirsty and they burn hotter, and I think farmers are really aware of the risks that they pose. And so for better or worse, that sort of moment helped to propel a ton of innovation, which is really exciting to see.
Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. All right, we have about 20 minutes for questions. I have, oh, that's a great little notebook. I have a whole bunch of them, but we want to reserve most of the time for you. I'm going to reserve a little bit of time at the end for a closing lightning round set of questions. But I'm going to start with one question, so think about yours. And if there aren't that many of you, I may alternate as we go to it. But I want to turn to our panelists. Now that you've been sitting here, you've given your excellent presentations. Well, let's give them another round of applause. That was really interesting. You've heard from everybody else. You've thought about it. What one or two sentences, and no more than that, would you want to add to what you've already said? Because we pushed you to only be 12 minutes. You all could have gone on for an hour each if you had been given the time. So what one thing or two things, or one thing in two sentences, would you want to toss into the mix before we get into the audience questions?
I just am continually amazed by the thirst for innovation out there. There is the need and the capacity for, but to your point, there needs to be some leadership. And some of that leadership needs to be from the public sector, and certainly the private sector will help too. But it's not for lack of want. And the opportunities that are out there, I can't overemphasize how much the communities are ready for change. And the speed at which those changes are coming seems to be increasing.
Well, and kind of adding to that point, I think going back to I did mention about meeting producers where they're at and their reality. At the end of the day, the problems are not going to get any better, and we are seeing we're seeing major changes in the industry. I know from a personal perspective with our own operation, when we converted to no-till in 2004, about 8 years after that, we started doing cover crops. But where I'm going with this is that when we converted, one of the things Dad said at that point, he was in his late 70s, and he told my brother and I, he said, if you weren't for you boys, I wouldn't do this because I know what I'm doing. This is a system that I understand, but you guys want to do this into the future. But when you stop and think about how the average age of agriculture producers is well over the age of 60 in the state of Oklahoma, that's a real challenge because they don't have that many more harvests left. And if they understand a system and they've got it, trying to help them to prepare for that future, and then to think, how do we prepare for the future generations coming up before us? Because at the end of the day, after those guys pass, we're still going to need food and fiber. And we're going to need it in a changing landscape that we've already talked about, all the challenges that we're seeing out there. Having that leadership, giving that thought to it, and addressing the problem head on, because the other side of that coin is hiding our head in the sand is not going to make it go away. And I do worry sometimes that there's a lot of folks out there that are more than willing to dig a hole and tell a producer, just go ahead and stick your head in that hole, everything's going to be fine. It's not going to be fine. And we've got to think about that, not just as individual producers, but as a society preparing for the future.
Great.
And I'll go with, just like my inappropriate jokes at the office rarely find the right time and place for the sentence, but I'll like to say something about water markets that it didn't quite fit in any of these. One issue with water markets is there's a whole, at least in the agriculture economics discipline, this whole push to push water uses to higher value uses essentially. So less agriculture, more industrial essentially. But the challenge with that is one needs to think about what the value of water in agriculture is. And it's a paradoxical concept, because the value of water in agriculture is not that the value of water is the extraction cost. The value of water in agriculture is cheap food. So how do you value something where the value is that it is low price?
Exactly.
Right, and so that's why, even though I'm an economist, I have some limited faith on market solutions for water allocations, and I'd encourage everybody when they think about value of water in agriculture, you need to think what the value is. It's not the cost of extraction or the price as an input.
You may have just become my favorite economist. The economists are important, but there are values beyond the dollar numbers. Very good. Lindsay.
I would just add maybe that the business resilience of companies is tied intrinsically to the resilience of rural communities, and that investment thesis is becoming more and more salient. And so this is a really exciting in some ways moment, terrifying in others. But yeah, if we can figure out how to channel sort of this focus and this appetite to build business resilience, I think we could have some really cool stuff happening.
Yeah, that is great. That's an optimistic place. All right, let's turn to your questions. It's a big room. I'll alternate between the sides, and then I'll toss in others of mine as we go. I'm looking at this side of the room first. Any questions? Yeah. I think there's supposed to be a microphone. Is there a floating microphone?
Yes to both questions, I guess.
It's okay, I'll try to project my voice. Wonderful session. The title is I heard soil mentioned once by the farmer in the street. I'd sustainability is not sustainable. So I'd like to see you come beside the great presentation from the farmer. The rest of you did not mention anything about soil.
Felicia, could you repeat it for our online folks? Or I can attempt to. Sorry, I'm standing over here. I know you're looking for. I didn't get over there with it. So maybe I could summarize that. Could the panelists address how soil is critical to this conversation, just for our online?
So it was soil. Yes. Well, that's so good because I heard soy. I'm glad you repeated the question.
I guess I would say it goes hand in glove with water. I mean, if you think about the arc of advancements in the way we use our water in the Great Plains, 40 years ago, we disked everything. We had exposed ground. Summer followed, and today, the ground's always covered. That's why we don't have dirt in the air very often anymore. It also, unfortunately, leads to some of our problems with wildfires. But the way we manage water and the way we manage soil, I think, go hand in glove. And from my perspective, that was an omission, not on purpose. It simply goes together.
Others?
I'd like to defend myself that I did talk about soil, just didn't mention the word soil. And the two aspects were and to go along with the hand in glove comment, I talked about the multi-cropping. We do season-long crop, harvest the cash crop and plant the winter crop right behind it. So it's a crop that covers the soil. It's not a cover crop, but talked about runoff and the need to establish the recovery, capture, and storage facilities to reuse runoff. That also has soil implications that go beyond the capture of the water, because you do capture the sediment. As you engineer these infrastructures, you essentially have to thinking of micro basins. And so once you have the farmer thinking about micro basins, he's more conscious about what goes on top of the soil. So all of your nutrient runoff, all of your herbicide, pesticide application, everything that you put on the soil is going to end up in water that you're going to want to reuse. So that's, as said before, hand in glove with soil management. So I'll say that I also talk a little bit about that. I just didn't mention soil.
Totally agree that they're very much related, and a focus on soil is required to sort of achieve some of the water goals that we're thinking about. I think from a company perspective, if I'm sort of putting on the private sector hat, you're likely to get more procurement attention and interest in investing if you're thinking about a water scarcity lens. I think it's harder to get those folks to relate to soil and understand the importance in that context, and think about it in sort of the resource context that everybody in this room is aware of. So usually that's the entry point. That's sort of what gets people's attention. That's how you focus the programs. But in terms of implementing those programs, executing the toolkit is very much focused on what soil can deliver with some of those water solutions. So yeah.
The only thing I'll add to it real quick is that, at least from my perspective anyway, to me, the natural, whether you're talking about we're talking about cycles, the water cycle, the nutrient cycle, and the carbon cycle, and how we manage that land resource and how it interacts with the rest of the ecosystem, I think is a key component in addressing any of it. I steal a line from a gal who wrote a book a few years ago. When I give a talk, normally the title side says The Secret's in the Soil, because I honestly believe that, and how we manage that soil resource has huge implications on all these things.
That's great.
One shout out on thing I forgot to say.
Yeah.
We haven't said anything about animals, and it matters, especially at the 100th meridian and in those dryland systems, having particular rumen sitting around, but animal agriculture has a role to play in all this sustainability also.
So I was getting ready to say that book, Cat, the Secret's in the Soil. The other book that I steal the title on is Cows Can Save the Planet. That's the other one too. So.
Great. I have a question in the back over there. Thank you for having something on this side of the room as well. I can't tell you how often there's only one side of the room, and I feel like I'm doing a Paula Poundstone thing. If you all have heard her routine on talking to the airplane, and if you haven't, you should look it up at the break.
Thanks to all of you. Roy Paulman Farms. I'm Southwest Nebraska producer, 80% groundwater irrigated, 20% rain fed, and clearly innovation continues at light speed. And the connection, though, and adoption is what all of you are kind of dancing around, is the adoption process, and how do we make it compelling enough, financial enough, and stewardship and conservation driven to the point that it's a no-brainer. It's the right thing to do. And I bring it up every time I speak across the country. When you look at the adoption curve, it pales. Even NRCS and others that are trying to bridge that gap that you've touched on, those seed dollars are important, and reaching the right producer at the right time in their career. But today, the challenge from our seat is the investment in the next 5 years. So when Schooler makes a call for us, or for a particular corn or a particular wheat or a soy product, it's not just as simple as putting it in the planter and putting it on our farm. It doesn't work that way anymore. When you're buying a $700,000 planter or a $1 million combine at the scale that we've worked our way into, those investments are critical to the success of that producer, but also those partnerships. And so those little infrastructure pieces in terms of investment. So I'm curious, everybody has this idea around innovative financing. I'd like to hear an applied, maybe from the economist in the room, what that looks like, because we're all tasked and we're all evaluated from a rural bank or a farm credit, and those are very specific criteria that we have to meet to qualify for that kind of funding or funding assistance. And it doesn't necessarily play well to make additional investments into the changes or transition and the cost to that regenerative. I'm curious about any successes that you would have in that space, any of you.
That's great.
Sorry, Felicia.
No, you know what? It's awesome because it's really similar to the next question I was going to ask, but more pointed. Thank you.
Well, since I was called out, I guess I'll start. And I'm the one, I say at the office all the time, I'm the one guy around here that knows nothing about everything.
Sorry.
But I think in terms of financing and recommendations and all of that, and I'm perhaps because of my ignorance, I'm the one that always said the best optimization machine there is in agriculture is the farmer. And so what we're doing at NCAR, at National Center for Alluvial Aquifer Research, we're building decision tools to help the farmer make those decisions. I think the issues come giving the farmer what are the elements of the gamble, what are the risks, what are the payoffs, and how you bring that to a common denominator, which is a dollar sign. So we're building for example, we have a decision tool for electrification. We still have a lot of pumps driven by gasoline, diesel, and propane, and all of your optimization goes out of whack with those because you got one farm hand that wants to get off duty 2 hours earlier, and those engines are very easy to crank up, increase the RPMs, more fuel use, more wasted water, everything. So we have a tool, for example, for electrification. What's the cost of driving an electric line, putting an electric pump, some automation incorporated, and rather than tell the farmer, this is how you finance it or whatever, we give them, okay, so if you can get a loan, this is the annual capital recovery cost, these are the annual operational costs, this is how you compare with your old systems, and other parameters. For example, in pumping, you have your pump efficiency, if you are driving a shaft, the pump is driven by a shaft, there's a lot of efficiency losses. So we build the decision tools to allow you to input that, convert it to an annualized cost at whatever financial cost, because we're not going to be better than the bank in telling you at what interest rate this will pay off or not. We have to convert that to something you would understand operationally on a year to year, so you can make that gamble. So that's the economy's answer. A non-answer, but try to give you the elements for you to make that gamble.
Maybe I can provide.
Lead in for others in answering the question, but I was going to ask what the greatest barrier to innovation was, and whether it was technology, the math, human nature, politics, resources, or something else. So, if you could wipe out one barrier, what would it be? So you can answer in terms of the financing tools, but if you think it's something else, that'd just be interesting to say. And we should be brief in case there's one more. I got one more question over here.
I would just say, I'm frustrated as you are. The pricing signals from the consumer that wants to know where their food's coming from and how that plays into what we can bid for the crop to do that, and the government's role to help some of that. We want a lot of renewable fuel. Well, yeah, okay, so send us some clear price signals. All of those could be clear.
Well, I'm going to jump into Neverland just for a second, because this probably won't happen, but it's from a policy perspective, because I think one of the greatest challenges I mentioned about the age of my father. The other two, one of the biggest ones is just exactly what you said about price. I mean, especially in my part of the world, there's a reason why we buy equipment at a farm sale that's 25 years old. We hold on to it for another 30 years down in winter wheat country. We don't like to think about being on margin in Oklahoma, but we are, especially in my part of the world. I wish somebody somewhere on a policy level would turn this on its head. We're always thinking about supporting the agriculture producer, which we should, but to a certain extent, it's almost part of our infrastructure. Because, we're sitting here talking about water quality or quantity, but there's also the water quantity aspect. EPA actually has some studies from a few years back that showed that in priority watersheds where agriculture producers did soil health or regenerative agriculture, whatever you call it, for every dollar spent helping those producers convert those land treatment practices on their land, you're saving the town downstream somewhere in the neighborhood of $10. For every dollar, $10 in treatment costs that they didn't have to pay for. Because at the end of the day, if that crap gets in the water, somebody's going to have to clean it out before it can be drank or used for industrial use. Now, you throw on top of that quality of life, wildlife benefits, maintaining an agriculture production base for the future, fuel conservation, because you stop and think about it. OSU did a study. If you convert to no-till, 3 gallons of diesel less per acre per year to grow winter wheat crop in Oklahoma, conventional versus no-till. So, I mean, you've got that aspect of it. Climate change, reducing fuel use means less nitrous oxide, also increases carbon sequestration. Got all these societal benefits that are going along with it. Maybe it's time the government starts thinking, hey, this is as much a piece of infrastructure as roads and highways, because at the end of the day, if you're controlling soil erosion, you're also helping the highways, because that crap ain't going to fill up in the culvert every time you have a flood. So maybe the idea of working with producers and maybe turning this concept of farm supports on its head, instead of paying me for what I grow and what the price is, and helping me when prices drop, maybe paying me for how I farm and how I manage that resource base. And that might be an idea to throw out there. Now, devils in the details take a lot of cash, and right now just trying to hang on to cost share money is a fight unto itself, so it ain't going to happen. But something like that, because you're absolutely right. Finances, age of producer, and I'll throw the other one out there is peer pressure. Yeah, it doesn't bother me, but there's some guys, you go to the coffee shop, if everybody's conventional till farmers around and you're the one no-tiller, you're an oddball. And some guys, that bothers them. It doesn't bother me, but there's some guys that can really bug them. So those are the 3 things that I say are the biggest, at least in my part of the world, to adoption of some of these practices.
Great. Now, Lindsay, you can give your answer you were ready to give.
Really?
And you need to, but
yes.
And I apologize, I can't take one more question or do my last question because we need to stay on time.
So I think really related to the answers we've heard, we've seen a couple of examples of designing programs in degraded lands with a specific a set of management practices, and a company co-signing on loans for better loan terms and working with financial institution to do that. Those are contained programs, or working with a separate entity to provide crop insurance when, say, farmers are disqualified from crop insurance by introducing a new crop or using specific practices that aren't part of that specific program. And so I think these are all sort of isolated examples, and perhaps private sector can help to bridge the gap while we're waiting for policy to catch up and provide some of those services inherently.
Well, that's great. Now, thank you. I think we have a sense of panels for next time to focus on that question and really dig in on policy and financing would probably be great. Thank you all for the time. Let's thank this amazing panel for opening the conversation, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of this amazing conference.